is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Now, Africa's economic growth forecast over the next 1 year is projected to be lower than 5%. And that is why the focus of this year's World Economic Forum on Africa is achieving inclusive growth through responsive and responsible leadership. Well, Africa's heads of state and captains of industry converged in Durban, South Africa this week to map out some of the priorities to achieve that growth on the continent. Tonight, CGTN takes a look at some of the discussions that took place. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Africa's transport corridors are expensive and inefficient, restricting business activity and intra-Africa trade. So bearing these challenges in mind, how can Africa's extractive transport corridors be transformed to drive local industrial development? Well, at the World Economic Forum on Africa in Durban, I sat down with Africa's business leaders to find out how. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special session on unlocking Africa's industrial corridors. May I now introduce my members of the panel. Her Excellency Sarah Kungogelwa Amadila. She's the Prime Minister of Namibia. Welcome to the panel. May I also introduce Iyabonga Gama. He's the Group Chief Executive Officer at Transnet South Africa. Welcome to the session. Mr. Johan Ulrich is the Global Managing Partner and Chairman of the Board at A.T. Kearney in the UK. Welcome to the program. And Michael Druce, President, Africa UPS South Africa. Welcome to the session. Prime Minister, I'm going to start off with you because your government in Namibia says that it wants to turn Namibia into a logistics hub and highway for a gateway into the SADC region. First of all, how do you plan to do that? What are the strategies that are in place for this, and how do you expect this to impact on regional trade between Namibia and the SADC countries?
Yes, thank you very much. Namibia ranks very highly on its priority for the public budget, the development and the rehabilitation of transport infrastructures. They take up a large chunk of the government's budget, and we are also forging partnerships with the private sector by passing laws. Recently, we passed the public-private partnership that will encourage the private sector to invest in the development of infrastructures of all sorts, actually, air, rail, road, harbor, and also to partner with us in the management of those infrastructures. Besides that, we believe that apart from locating ourselves as a transport and logistical hub, to be the gateway for SADC to the Americas and Europe, we believe that that would also help us to optimize benefits from regional integration. Because what we have observed is that as African countries, we agree on an integration agenda in order to promote trade amongst us, but we find that we trade more with the world than with ourselves because we don't identify our competitive niches and advance them in order that we can promote the regional economic growth, and that is what Namibia is trying to do now. So through these infrastructures, we are linked with 6 to 7 countries with 3 different transport corridors, one going up north, the one down south, and the one to the east to link us with all these countries. And as I have said, that it would help us to be the gateway, but it will also make us an attractive investment ground because we are a small economy with 2 million people. And we believe that we'll be able to attract investors only if they know that by locating in Namibia, they have access to the regional market, which is a much bigger market, and also that through logistics and transport, we can also generate jobs and income for Namibia.
Right, Iyabonga Gama, those 6 countries in the SADC region are landlocked there, but there are about 18 transport corridors going across the region. What are the major constraints, though, in terms of connectivity for these 18 corridors?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with either old or dilapidated infrastructure, which needs to be upgraded. Some of the corridors, they exist in terms of name, but they are not fully operational because of some of those bottlenecks. So investment in infrastructure is important. Sometimes there's also just squabbling between countries to say, in terms of these different links, who is responsible for what kind of investment. So that also creates constraints. But I think there is an overall political will from an AU perspective to say, let us look at all of these corridors, and there are champions that have been chosen in terms of each of these corridors to say, how do you debottleneck each one of them? But I think the other problem is that even though these corridors, they cut through countries, the decision making has to take place in individual countries. How do you integrate this? How do you make sure that when you start making an investment in one part of the corridor, that there's other investments that are properly timed elsewhere in order for that to happen? So sometimes you get the notion that we also have too many decision-making layers. We don't make decisions quickly enough. But also sometimes there's just over-regulation, which then gets into the face and the place of implementation. And then we find that we are not making progress as quickly as we would want to do. So we need to then begin to say, in each of these corridors, if someone is a champion, can they take overall responsibility in terms of the kinds of decisions that need to get taken in order for that corridor to be debottlenecked? Because with each corridor that we are able to debottleneck, we can increase intra-African trade tenfold, because we are now able to move the vast mineral resources that the continent has from producers to where the markets are. Because that is the critical thing that is going to create jobs. That is the critical thing that is going to make sure that we've got economic growth, that we can bring about a better standard of living to our people. The other constraint that we have is also the constraint of power and energy. It's quite important that that constraint also gets removed, because if we are to beneficiate, as you said in your opening statement, we need quite a bit of energy. So it is energy, it is the transport corridors themselves, which will assist us in terms of linking producers, importers and exporters.
All right, Mr. Ulrich, though, the whole idea of transport corridors, they have been on the agenda, Africa's agenda since 1970s, and your company, though, a report presented by your company last year did suggest that infrastructure quality and connectivity in Africa is what is stopping investors' ability to invest on the continent. What, in your view, though, is hampering the development of transport corridors on the continent?
I think at the highest level, there are three big areas where we need to make improvement on, and some were already mentioned previously. The first and most important thing, I think, is transport corridors is not a matter of concrete or of funds in the first place. You have to take a systems view of this. It's absolutely essential. It's only when everything works together in harmony that it begins to work. And that sounds maybe very simple, but it's something that a lot of people often forget. You need tax systems, you need standards, you need, look across all the borders in Africa, you often see rows and rows of trucks waiting. And it's not necessary, really. We all understand why we're there, but it's really not necessary. So it's really important to take that systems view and to work at all the different levels. And I know a lot of people are doing that. The African Union is doing that. A lot of governments are doing that. But that is the biggest single issue. So it's not funds. There's a lot of money available. There's a backlog of projects, and it's not the concrete. It's really the overall system that doesn't work. So that's number one. The number two is the minister rightfully said so. Africa needs to shift from global export of raw materials largely to more a mix of global export and intra-African trade. It's really essential. The global economy is slowing down. Trade is slowing down. African population is growing, and it's absolutely essential that Africa harvests the wealth that it has, and that is really, it needs to be unlocked, and you unlock that by largely working on African trade. Very hard to do. We all know that, but it's incredibly important to do so. That's the number two. The number three is technology. Often forgotten, but a lot of global supply chains and global systems are going through fundamental change right now. Robotics, artificial intelligence, IoT, all those aspects. And it leads often to more local production. That's one of the biggest effects that it has. And also for that reason, Africa needs to step up in terms of its technology. It helps intra-African trade, and it needs to be facilitated by well-functioning system corridors. Those are the three biggest trends that I would.
So Michael Drews here, Africa needs to step up its technology though, and the African continent is said to have the highest transport costs in the world. You operate on the continent though. What extra, how is this though, the high cost, how is this affecting your supply? What extra costs do you need to bear as a result of this lack of connectivity?
I think there's two sides to this. One is, what type of logistics and transportation are FDIs looking for? Anybody that wants to come into Africa and develop manufacturing capacity, the first thing they're going to look at is logistics. Yes, power is important. Availability of land to build and to grow is important. But logistics is key, because unless you can get your product to market, then you're going to struggle to compete with imports that are coming into Africa. And we've talked already about the fact that so little of Africa's trade is intra-Africa, and based on the last WTO statistics, 17% of trade stays within Africa. Compare that with Asia, which is sitting at 48%. Okay? Europe's as high as 65%. Well, Europe's a single market, so you'd expect that. So how does that change, and how do we change it? How do we encourage FDIs to come in, build manufacturing capacity? Well, the key is providing with logistics capability. Now, if we look at the growth in Asia over the last 30 to 40 years, they pioneered a concept called just-in-time. Started in Japan back in the 70s, and that revolutionized manufacturing and production in Asia. And if you look at places like Thailand now, Thailand produces 60% of the components that go into Japanese cars. So manufacturing happens wherever businesses want it, because the logistics is there to support it. And going back to what the Prime Minister of Namibia was saying earlier, they want to attract manufacturing that could feed into supply chains in other countries. So the key to that is the ability to move components and finished products quickly across borders. And at the moment, too much of what is imported into Africa ends up in warehouses, purely because people are so worried about their supply chains, they hold stock. And as we know, capital is not cheap in Africa, so that adds to the challenges that businesses face, where they have to keep large amounts of stock in warehouses rather than be able to bring it in as and when they need it.
Right, and so I come back to you, Prime Minister, because you've heard the views from the panelists, and as Yabonga Gama there said, it is not just about money. So do the experiences from the panelists on the floor, do they resonate with what you're trying to do, and what is your biggest challenge when you're trying to create your logistics hub?
Yes, these are all things that we are working on. For Namibia, the special challenge really is the vastness of the land, given its small population, and the way that people are settled, because we do not only have to link to other countries within SADC and to link the production centers to export exit points. We also have to link communities to critical services, for example, in addition to linking production centers to markets within the country. So that is the largest challenge for us. But in terms of savings, we are leading amongst the leaders within the region. We actually do export much of our capital to Big Brother down south. So our challenge maybe is to develop our capital markets so that we strengthen its capacity to intermediate and allocate the local savings to local investments. And the other challenge is now to attract the foreign investors by addressing the skills shortages that we are faced with. And in this regard, we are not only prioritizing that within the budget, we are also looking at attracting private investors into the sector.
Africa is not one story.
So, Michael Drews, though, there must be some innovative ways that your company is dealing with or finding in order to overcome all these constraints. Otherwise, you'd be out of business. So, what are those innovative ways that you're finding to deal with the constraints on the continent?
Okay. Well, I'll come to that in a moment, but I just want to expand on what Johannes just said about some good examples of where progress has been made. If we look at East Africa is developing the East Africa Customs Union. And getting back to what my colleague from Transnet just said, governments working together is key. And yes, companies like ours, we can put technology in place, we can put all kinds of processes and systems in place, but we're still very much dependent on the customs authorities and the will of governments to make meaningful change. And we heard an awful lot a year ago in Kigali about what's happening in the East Africa Customs Union. We're seeing examples of it ourselves. You can now move goods freely from Kenya into Rwanda, into Uganda, and they're developing the transport networks to help build on that as well. So I think East Africa is a good example of what can happen if governments and leadership put their mind to making meaningful change. And logistics companies like ourselves will very quickly adapt our own systems and processes to work within those capabilities. But it all comes back down to will, because traditionally across Africa, the customs authorities have tended to be revenue collectors rather than trade facilitators. And that has to slowly change as well. Yes, the fiscus is important, but without fast and quick movement of goods, it's very hard for foreign companies to come in and say, we want to put a manufacturing operation in a Rwanda or in a Kenya or in a Tanzania, because they want to serve other markets. They don't just want to serve the domestic market, but they don't want to be constrained by the inability to move stuff across borders because of the difficulties with customs clearance and the bureaucracy that exists, particularly if they have to cross more than one border. So from our perspective, technology and using data efficiently to clear goods before they've even left, so that on arrival they can be delivered straight to the customer instead of to a warehouse, is something that we're starting to see much more in Africa. The bandwidth is available, the technology is available, the data is available. Customs are becoming more receptive, but it's a slow process, and what we're looking for is more leadership, similar to what we're seeing in East Africa.
Right. Yes, Iagoma.
I think also perhaps what we need to do is to pick a few critical regions and issues. If, for instance, we take the system of ports, because I think ports are an important aspect. We have too many small ports, which means we don't get the benefits of scale, and we don't get the benefits of density as well, because we do not have big hinterlands, or the hinterlands that we ought to have are not integrated in terms of either road or rail, in terms of the back of port activities. So one of the things that we probably should look at is what kind of collaborative strategies should we have, and what kind of specialization should each region have? Because we do have what I call a Me Too mentality, where everybody says, so-and-so has done this, so therefore I'm going to do it. So we end up competing, but when we compete, we actually increase costs. We need to be beginning to say, if we have a system of ports, what is the kind of regional ports master plan that we could have? Concentrate on a few to bring out benefits, because at the end of the day, it is about reducing the cost of doing business. If we want to be competitive, we need to make sure that these corridors actually come out with supply chains that are efficient and competitive, because it is supply chains that compete. So it is really of no use for us to try and do too many things without focusing on a few things that are going to strengthen our regions, strengthen our supply chains. Maybe we should not look at some of these things just from a country-to-country perspective. We should begin to say, in a particular country, which port is going to become a bulk port? What is the kind of rail and road infrastructure that must connect with it? Where are the critical minerals and resources that to be moved? Where are the markets? So what is the best place, either east, west, or south, for us to make sure that we strengthen those supply chains? I think that kind of discussion around cooperation, around density, around specialization, around economies of scale can assist us in terms of saying how do we create better market access and make sure that we don't try to do too many things at once, but we really focus on the things that are going to give us the highest impact in terms of Pareto optimality.
Yes, Mr. Oric.
If I can follow up on that, I strongly agree with that. More specialization and more focus and more scale and more in-depth investment is absolutely key to make this work. This is very hard to do with 53 governments. Just look at the difficulties that Europe has with 27. And therefore, I would argue to try to do that in the first place with a few countries or a few people that are aligned and that want to make that happen. Like in East Africa, the example, or South Africa, etc. It's a much better way of doing that. I would not want to focus, though, this conversation too much on the difficulties, because we often tend to talk about the difficulties, and there are many, as we all know. This is not easy to do, because, as I said, it's a system change that needs to take place. But the price is fantastically high. The biggest resource of Africa is not the commodities, it's its people. And a lot of people tend to forget that. And that's a fantastic resource. If you can unlock that, perhaps not always at the level of 53 countries, but at subsets, and make concrete progress there, the price is fantastic, and I would be optimistic about that.
Right, Michael Drews, because earlier on it was mentioned here by Sia Boma here that perhaps the operational systems now are starting to kick in. As you traverse the continent, though, are you starting to see a lot more of a streamlining of regulation of operational systems on the continent?
It's quite sporadic. I touched on East Africa earlier, and SADC is also starting to get a lot more aligned. But one of the real challenges that a lot of companies face is the fact that they have to cross multiple borders, and keeping stocking facilities, for example. You take high-tech companies, they want to support their businesses and their engineers. They have to keep stocking locations in every single country. They're unable to set up a stocking location in South Africa, for example, because as soon as they move those goods across the border into Namibia or into Botswana or Zambia, they have to then, if they don't keep it in bond, they have to pay duties again, because you can't clear at first country of arrival, because again there's a lack of cooperation between governments. So if South Africa collects the revenue and the goods end up in Namibia, South Africa then hands that revenue over to Namibia. That isn't taking place at the moment, and it's fueled growth in Europe over the last 30 years, the ability to clear in the country of arrival. So East Africa, again, is looking at this. It's saying, well, if we clear goods in Kenya, can we then move them freely into Rwanda and Uganda? And the ability to do that, again, is going to be transformational, because people will then be able to look at where they want to keep their critical stock if they're forced to do that. Because that's a lot more cost effective than either flying it indirect because of the time it takes. So if they have to keep stock, far better to be able to keep it in one location and then move it through a cluster of countries using, whether it's express operators, cargo operators. We haven't talked an awful lot about, the role air freight plays in Africa. It's very much perishables that move more by air freight and high-tech goods. But again, what's Africa going to do about developing its infrastructure to move critical items by air? Again, back to the whole just-in-time thing I spoke about earlier.
Right, Siyaboma Goma, I'll come back to your point about, you did mention earlier on at the beginning of this session that it is not just about money, that money can be found. But if you look at the connectivity of countries and you look at their levels of development, the varying levels of development, starting from Namibia, Botswana to South Africa, or even Lesotho. Where will they find this money to ensure that there is that connectivity from ports all the way to the hinterland?
Yeah, I think probably what we need to zero in is to say, having identified and defined the corridors, each country must then say what role does it play in that corridor and what kind of bilateral does it require with the adjacent country or a country that's contiguous to it in order to make the entire corridor work. I mean, the Development Bank of South Africa, the IDC, the PIC, the African Development Bank, we've got many financial institutions that are ready to fund infrastructure programs, but they need to be presented in a particular way. The funding to me is not an issue. I think what we should be saying is that each country or each corridor has got an industrialization objective. So therefore, what investment program is going to assist it in terms of creating this? But I think also, I think we need to also zero in on this issue of the markets. I think if we can create one common market for Africa, we are talking about just over 1 billion people. 35 to 40% of that is youth. There's a lot of things that are going to be required. There's internet connectivity that is required in terms of telecoms and power. There is a lot, I think, that we should be able to do going forward, but it starts with forward planning, it starts with foresight, but it also begins to say when we cooperate and we work together and we say how do we make quicker decisions, where will that get us to? So I think the issue of funding for me is not really a constraint in terms of capacitating, or creating the kinds of mechanisms that we need in order for us to move forward.
Right. Prime Minister, you have the final word.
Yes, I would agree with that and say as a government, we want to call upon our stakeholders in the private sector to work with us in operationalizing these systems that we have put in place, the one-stop border post, the customs cooperation at the borders, the ITAs, the public-private partnership. I think with this, really, if we can implement them in true partnership, we are going to realize a lot of positive results.
All right. Thank you, members of the panel. We'll leave it there for the moment, and that is it for this session. Her Excellency Sarah Kugongelwa Madila, the Prime Minister of Namibia. Thank you. Siyabonga Gama, Group Chief Executive Officer, Transnet South Africa. Mr. Johan Ori, Global Managing Partner and Chairman of the Board, A.T. Kearney. And Mr. Michael Drews, President, Africa, UPS, South Africa. Thank you very much for being on this session, and thank you very much for joining us in this discussion. This session is a wrap. Bye-bye.